The Apostle Paul said, "Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast." In Do This in Remembrance of Me, Dr. Anderson takes you through a Christian telling of the greater Exodus. This new resource will give you all the tools you need to prepare for and keep the feast. That is the Feast of Unleavened Bread that Paul exhorts us to keep. This Haggadah or telling comes in both full-color hardback or an economy spiral-bound black and white version. It includes a 4-day pre-study, the Seder night telling itself, and an appendix with helpful tips, checklists, recipes, and instructions to help you prepare for and keep this important appointed time of the Lord. To find out more, go to prolongyourdays.com.
Welcome back to Prolong Your Days with Dr. Christy Anderson. Today we are talking about emotions again. This is part 2 in a series there's so much depth on this. I'm not really sure how many 30-minute sessions this will take to get through, but we're just going to see how far we get today. And I'm really excited to share with you a few of the primary emotions and some of the questions you can ask when these emotions come up, and then just introduce in more depth some of the first primary emotions and see how far we get. Now, what's interesting is that all of us have multiple intelligences. If you've ever heard of Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, you'll know that he talks about 7 different intelligences. I think he added 1/8 one, which you'll see in the picture here. We have the visual spatial, then the linguistic verbal, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal, the logical or mathematical, and then the musical, and then bodily kinesthetic. Of course, later on he added that naturalistic, but most people at least agree on the first 7. As far as primary, like, we all have different strengths, and we all have a little bit of each of these, but we have differing degrees of strength in one or more areas. And sometimes that changes over time, and depending on what we put our emphasis in, and what we push into more, what grows, right? So we have these different intelligences, right? And then we have another layer. We have our emotions that we're focusing on now, and within the scope of emotions, we can divide that into kind of 4 different areas of the person. Sometimes you'll see this discussed like with Watchman Nee or different Christian theorists that talk about the inner man versus the outer man, and the different layers, the soul and the spirit and the body, and making different vocabulary to describe those different phenomena. So for our purposes here, I'm going to describe the physical, like our physical makeup. We come from, man was, when God made Adam, he came from the Adamah, the ground, and it was earthy and it was red. So I'm gonna say the earthy physical is what we're looking at, or what we'll describe as one element. So I'm going to call that the earthy physical, the Adamah. And then we'll have the airy intellect. So your mind, it's kind of up here in the air, right? So your mind, you're thinking, but we'll say the airy part, we'll call it the airy intellect. And then I will describe the emotions, as we said in the first program, as water, the watery emotions, because they're very much in constant flow, and it's more a matter of degree. So you always have emotions going, it's just they're on this sliding scale of how high or low or how strong, or kind of like a little bit like electricity too, depending on how much is going through, right, and how much power is going through. And then we have fiery vision. So we'll describe our vision, and this is both used through the sight, but in terms of like visualization and what you can see for the future. So it has different aspects to it, but we'll call it the fiery vision. So we'll have fiery vision, watery emotions, we'll have earthy physical nature, and then the airy intellect. Now we're really focusing on the watery emotions right now, but this is sort of the different ways that we describe different elements of our makeup and our being and our intelligence and how we handle things and how we process things. And so all of these things, when we have, these are like tools in your toolbox for relationships. And in our culture today, the emotions are so swung to a level of importance, at least in the popular culture, in the media and so forth, that emotions are driving and defining everything now, which is out of scope of what should be reality. And it dishonors man, and it dishonors God. And the other extreme is our stoic culture, the people that cut off emotion and don't even consider it, or disrespect it and don't give it any honor either, and don't listen to the messages that God designed for us to use and engage with our emotions and to worship. You need emotion, and so there's a place for emotion. But how do we listen and understand the messages that God has given us in the different emotions, what they're trying to tell us, and how do we honor that so that we can honor other people and bring the kingdom culture, which is a culture of honor, to bear in all of our relationships. So that's really what we're getting at here today. I'd like to pull up a chart here and show you that if you've seen what's popular today, and it's called the Enneagram, kind of understanding, it plays off the Myers-Briggs type of personality, but goes a little bit beyond that and then focuses more in a biblical direction, trying to understand and get in a little more detail beyond that one. And one of the interesting things that it shows is that if you are an 8, 9, or 1, like one of the major emotions that you tend to default to is anger or rage. If you're a 2, 3, or 4, you're going to be in shame. Will be one of the primaries. So the shame is like anger. It's just an internal, as we said, sentry. He's going to be telling you, oh, I shouldn't do this, should do that. That's that internal guard. And then the anger and rage, that's the external guard from somebody's attacking you or you're trying to defend someone else. And then fear is, if you're a 7, 6, or 5, fear is one of the primary emotions that you might be dealing with. So all of us sort of have an emotion that sorts to be our default, I guess you would call it. And for me, I'm in the 8 in this case, so I'm in the anger rage category. And so part of the reason I'm really pushing into this is to try to grow in this area, to really understand, you know, the role of anger and how to use it in that sounds weird, to use it in a healthy, godly way, but there's a purpose for righteous anger. And how do we listen to this emotion? How do we process it? How do we not let it become a sword against people and use it for the way God intended? And so I'm going to kind of touch on these first emotions first, and then there's others that we might get into. It just depends on how long and everything that this will all take and how many shows. But so for anger, we did talk about that last week. So I'm going to start with that one, since if you're an 8, 9, or 1, this is going to really apply to you, but it'll apply to everybody. But particularly the 8, 9, or 1s will understand what I'm talking about here. I want to give you a quote from Carla McLaren, and she wrote a book on emotional intelligence that I'm drawing some of these truths from. She's not a believer, but God has definitely gifted her with great, great insight into empathy, and there was a lot of nuggets of truth that she's just really hit on that are biblical truths that she just doesn't recognize are actually biblical. And so when you read her book, you'll really see that she just at this point is not giving, she's giving honor to the emotions that God gave instead of giving honor to God who gave the emotions, having recognized the role and the proper role that they're supposed to play in such a powerful way. So, our prayer is that eventually God will lead her into coming to know him in a deeper way, but she definitely has been gifted in that area from God. And so I'm going to draw on some of the insights that she has that are very much biblical, but that will help us walk through and really analyze our emotions. So she says, healthy anger sets your boundary and helps you engage more effectively because it allows you to relate authentically and respectfully. Those are very important biblical qualities, right? We want to relate both authentically and we want to relate respectfully. Remember, it's a kingdom culture of honor that we're trying to bring. Now, when you have awakened connection to your anger and a clear sense of your own boundary, you'll be able to honor boundaries and individuality in others. Therefore, your relationships won't be based on power struggles, projections, or enmeshment. So this is really important, and it's interesting because obviously we see how important this is because we see that even the Bible talks a lot about boundaries, about not moving your neighbor's boundary stones, and God sets boundaries when Israel was at the foot of the mountain, not to come too close to touch the mountain at particular times. And there was sacred space, and there was holy sacred space, and there were certain boundaries, and drawing near required certain different requirements based on certain boundaries, right? And so also just connecting and understanding yourself and who you are, where you begin and another ends. You don't get enmeshed with someone, right, overly, and to where you lose yourself. You don't have to project onto someone else. You can respect their individuality and your individuality. And that's something our culture has really lost right now. This collectivist thing that loses the individual is really, really getting prevalent, and it's not biblical. It's very much unbiblical. God creates us individually. He has unique gifts to each of us individually, and we need to be able to honor each other in our individuality without becoming enmeshed or without groupthink, or which stifles creativity, etc. So today we're really going to dive a little deeper into anger. And I know I started to give a little bit of that, but we want to go in more depth. Now I want you to think of anger as your sentry. He's your guard. He's your external guard, or you could say your sage at times too, telling you, and something has come up that needs to be defended. So it's a protective and a restorative gift from God, our anger, when we know how to direct it and not let it direct us. Now, if your boundaries are broken down by an incident, by a situation, whatever the case may be, it's anger's job to alert you, obviously, and you're going to get that surge of energy. So it'll give you that surge of energy. It'll restore your sense of strength because you've just had something violated. So you get this surge of energy to give you some strength, right? And it's going to give you a sense of need for separateness. So as the sentry, the anger, as I said, is like these boundary guards, and they're for protection and stability. So if we don't honor anger and we don't listen to the message that it has, and we don't know how to use it and direct it appropriately, then we're not going to have the ability to rise up and protect the innocent or ourselves, and in certain situations, or we will lack stability in our relationships. So protection and stability is one of the kind of gifts that we get in anger at its appropriate application and when it's honored. Now, some of the biblical, I want to run through a few biblical verses that give us an idea about boundaries from Scripture. Deuteronomy 19:4 says, "You shall not move your neighbor's boundary mark." I mentioned that already. "Which the ancestors have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess." So we can't have inheritance, and the whole focus of the gospel is our inheritance. We need boundaries for an inheritance, so boundaries are important. Deuteronomy 27:17, "Cursed is he who moves his neighbor's boundary mark," and all the people shall say amen. So from a biblical perspective, the boundary of the nations and the boundary of property, personal property rights, these are biblical concepts that God established even for Israel, for the nations, and for all of us to have an inheritance. Deuteronomy 32:8, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Right? Okay, so I already mentioned that a little bit, but there's your example. Job 38:8 says, or who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth it went out from the womb, when I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band. And I placed boundaries on it, and set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no farther. And here shall your proud waves stop. Okay, obviously this is talking about where the oceans would come and no further, and it's according to the word of the Lord. And so he set boundaries for oceans and boundaries for where the land would be. So it's also seen in nature there, in other words. Psalm 74:17. You have established all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. Okay, so time has boundaries. There's normal everyday work time, and there's sacred time, the Shabbat, the Sabbath. From the seventh day. We have day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the seventh day, which in its root comes where we get the idea of Shabbat or Sabbath or rest. Okay, so we have the seventh day. So there's time has boundaries. And then we have Proverbs 8:29, when he set for the sea its boundary, so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. So we have, again, more allusions here to the water, the boundaries of the seas, so it wouldn't transgress his word. Very powerful and metaphoric speech, but also very literal. Proverbs 15:25, the Lord will tear down the house of the proud, but he will establish the boundary of the widow. I thought this is very interesting, that how the proud tear down the house. So what are they doing? They're breaking a boundary. You have a private space and they're breaking that down. They break down the boundaries, but God himself will establish the boundary of the widow, meaning here we're saying that boundary is her security, right? So boundary and security and sentry and providing protection, it's all coming together here in this verse. Jeremiah 5:22. Do you not fear me, declares the Lord? Do you not tremble in my presence? For I have placed the sand as a boundary for the sea, an eternal decree, so it cannot cross over it. Though the waves toss, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, they cannot cross over it. Again, we have somewhat metaphoric, but also very literal, like the sea, he sets its boundaries again. And the sand is used to be a boundary for the sea. So we could take that a little bit farther if we wanted to and see it in other places. Now, Ezekiel 47:13 says, thus says the Lord God, this shall be the boundary by which you shall divide the land for an inheritance among the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph shall have 2 portions. So here we see the boundaries of the land and the inheritance among the 12 tribes are set, right? Then Hosea 5:10, the princes of Judah have become like those who move a boundary. On them I will pour out my wrath like water. So here we have anger and rage, the wrath of God coming against those who break and move boundaries. Okay, so we can take this, not only this is very literal, obviously, in the land, the princes of Judah become like those who move boundaries. On them I will pour out my wrath like water. Notice the connection there. Emotions described as water, and that wrath coming forth like water, and he's going to pour it out. Acts 17:26-27. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all of the earth, or the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times. Remember, I said time is boundary, and the boundaries of their habitation, So there's times that are appointed, or boundaries of time, and there's boundaries of where you live, your habitation, where each nation is going to have a unique gift to the world and a unique calling and a unique border. And it is sinful for people to disrespect those borders and to not honor people's space that God has given them in the various lands. Continuing in verse 27, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So part of the gifting that God gives to all these nations is in the hope that they will seek after him. Now, Exodus 19:12, you shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up on the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Again, holy and unholy, there's bounds of, and we have these kind of boundaries in relationships, holy and profane, good and evil. All of those things in the commandments of God are setting our boundaries and how we relate to each other, who can be with who and who can't, and all of those things in terms of intimate relationships, like you don't marry your sister, those kind of things, etc. So all of these things are very boundary related and are very necessary, and we need to guard them and we need to honor them. That's the key. Now, we also have relational boundaries we see in the temple tabernacle, as I mentioned. How one approaches God is going to have those kind of varying levels of restriction. Communal and family life, as I said. So now, at the heart of the boundaries and the idea, as I said, is honor. And we want to bring that to bear, honor to bear. We've lost it so much in our culture. We've lost it in the church. We've really lost it as central to everything we do is to bring honor to God. And so if we're not bringing honor in our relationships, then we're not bringing honor to God. And if we don't understand anger, we're not going to understand how to keep proper barriers, and honor the individuality of others and individual thinking and stuff within the bounds of God's kingdom and the kingdom principles. When we're violating and walking all over the Word of God, violating His instructions and those boundaries, we're dishonoring Him, but we're also doing the same with our relationships. So it's super important. Now, boundaries, as I said, are going to have a few more things we'll look at. They're going to provide safety from emotional and physical pain. Boundaries are necessary to avoid collectivism, as we mentioned before, and groupthink, in which uniqueness, the individual, is getting swallowed up in the collective. Boundaries are required for inheritance. We have an inheritance. It's central to the gospel. And so it's totally important. Again, allowing for personal property and individual ownership over land and personal possessions. These things are given by God, and envy and other sins make people want to take from others or violate boundaries or steal or, those kinds of things inappropriately and dishonorably. And we have to stand against that. There's a time, and our anger needs to rise up and properly reestablish proper boundaries and borders so that we can bring honor to all nations and to all people. Boundaries in regard to behavior and speech provide safety for emotional health and one's reputation, which brings us back to, again, the kingdom principle of honor. All of these things are necessary for honor. God's kingdom, as I said, requires that culture of honor. That's where we build this kingdom. Now, signs of obstruction. How do you know when honor has been violated? Well, there's repressive or expressive types of obstructions that you can look for with regard to the emotion of anger. A repressive, where you repress it, so it's not seen externally, it's kind of pushed inside, is called enmeshment. Okay? When someone gets walked all over, basically, if you're the type of person you're like, oh, I get just walked all over by everyone, and you lose who you are, you lose your sense of self, right? And as an individual, anyway. To the point that you're losing yourself. Examples Ignoring offenses would be an example. Making excuses for an offender rather than confronting hard issues in an honorable way. When people can offend you without consequence, not only are you going to get damaged in that, but the attacker will descend into abusive behavior, which is not good for them either. It literally allows them to go deeper into an abusive behavior pattern. You dishonor someone by refusing to confront them in an honorable way for improper behavior. McLaren, I wanted to give another quote in this regard that she said that was really powerful when she said, when you refuse to address your genuine emotions, you invite discord and deception, that's lies, into each of your relationships and every area of your life. I mean, think about that. When you refuse to confront something and you take that in, that's like planting a seed that you don't want planted in you of offense, right? That's how we get bitterness, roots of bitterness growing. So anger is there to warn you that there's been a violation. You get that surge of energy. But if something's repressed or disrupted, then that anger can't rise up, or it's ignored, right? So honoring the emotion of anger means not brushing it off with a pseudo-spirituality when you're attacked, but welcoming the surge of energy and that follows an attack, but without launching into a search and destroy mission. So that's the goal. Now there's also the expressive side. So that's the repressive. Now we have the expressive side, which is cycles of rage. So if you're having moments constantly on a regular basis, cycles of rage, basically in this process, then you're creating harsh boundaries, and those harsh boundaries can lead to what we see in culture with hatred, prejudice, and or isolation. You'll just withdraw from everyone, right? And you just become kind of this hermit. People often use anger as a tool to try to control other people through power, force, or projection. So you're just going to project on someone. Although enmeshment, as we were talking about, it can kind of do the same, but just going to be in a less obvious way or a less loud and obvious manner. So the goal as we're looking at each of these, though, is really based in trying to, as I said, bring honor to our use of anger and our understanding of it. That's all the time I have for today. So since we are halfway through this particular teaching, I will pick up with you next week and we'll just keep going where we left off. I hope you'll join us and go to Prolong Your Days for more information and to link to the YouTube page where you can get this whole teaching in full. Thanks so much and have a blessed day.
The Apostle Paul said, "Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast." In Do This in Remembrance of Me, Dr. Anderson takes you through a Christian telling of the greater Exodus. This new resource will give you all the tools you need to prepare for and keep the feast. That is the Feast of Unleavened Bread that Paul exhorts us to keep. This Haggadah or telling comes in both full-color hardback or an economy spiral-bound black and white version. It includes a 4-day pre-study, the Seder night telling itself, and an appendix with helpful tips, checklists, recipes, and instructions to help you prepare for and keep this important appointed time of the Lord. To find out more, go to prolongyourdays.com.